Every great album has songs, but the greatest albums leave behind stories. And today I'm going through every Pink Floyd studio album and giving you one hidden story from each. Some of these stories have genuinely changed how I hear these albums, and I know for a fact that one of them in particular will change the way you hear it forever. Let me know in the comments how many of these stories you already knew. Now, let's start at the beginning. The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. If you'd asked me where the Piper at the Gates of Dawn got its name from when I was younger, I'd probably have guessed it was something Sid dreamt up during one particularly psychedelic afternoon. It sounds mysterious, almost mythical, the sort of title that only Pink Floyd could have come up with. But it actually comes from somewhere far more innocent. The title is taken from a chapter in The Wind and the Willows. It's a beautiful moment in the book where Rat and Mole encounter the god Pan at sunrise. And the entire chapter is filled with this quiet sense of wonder, imagination, and childlike mystery. And once I discovered that, something about Syd Barrett suddenly made complete sense to me. He wasn't writing songs like his contemporaries, while the Beatles were becoming increasingly experimental. Bob Dylan was writing songs that challenged politics and society. Syd seemed fascinated by something much simpler: imagination itself. His world was filled with scarecrows, bicycles, gnomes, cats, and nursery rhyme characters. His songs almost sound like childhood stories that somehow wandered into London's psychedelic underground. I think that's why this album still feels so unlike the rest of Pink Floyd's catalogue. Before they became philosophers, before they became architects of these huge conceptual albums, they were just dreamers. And once you know where the title comes from, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn stops sounding like the birth of progressive rock and starts sounding like one final glimpse into Syd Barrett's imagination before the world slowly became too complicated for him. A Saucerful of Secrets. If The Piper at the Gates of Dawn captured Syd at his most imaginative, A Saucerful of Secrets quietly captures him slipping away. By the time recording had begun, Barrett's behaviour had become increasingly unpredictable. Some days he'd contribute almost nothing at all. Other days he'd simply stand in the studio holding his guitar, completely detached from what was happening around him. The rest of the band found themselves in an impossible position. Syd wasn't just their songwriter, he was Pink Floyd, but gradually it became clear they needed help. David Gilmour was brought into the band, initially with the idea that he'd simply support Syd on stage whenever he wasn't able to perform. It's such an unusual idea when you think about it. Imagine recruiting someone as a backup guitarist for the band's own founder. Of course, that arrangement didn't last. Barrett soon left the group entirely and David Gilmour became a permanent member. What's fascinating is that A Saucerful of Secrets lets you hear that transition happening in real time. It's the only Pink Floyd album where one era is literally fading out while the other quietly begins, and every time I listen to it now, I don't just hear an album. I hear a band trying desperately to hold itself together while saying goodbye to the person who created it. Which makes the next album all the more surprising. Out of all 15 Pink Floyd albums, More is probably one that people revisit the least. It was written as the soundtrack to a French film of the same name, and because of that, it often gets overlooked. But what surprised me most wasn't the music, it was how quickly it had to be written. Unlike a normal studio album, much of More was composed to fit scenes that had already been filmed. Instead of writing songs and letting them become whatever they wanted, Pink Floyd was suddenly writing to serve someone else's story. In hindsight, it almost feels like a creative exercise, a chance for a band still finding its identity to learn how mood, atmosphere, and pacing could tell a story without relying on conventional songwriting. And maybe that's why More matters more than its reputation suggests, because hidden inside this overlooked soundtrack are the first signs of the cinematic Pink Floyd that would eventually create Dark Side of the Moon. Ummagumma, if more was Pink Floyd learning how to tell someone else's story, Ummagumma was the complete opposite. Nobody told them what to do. In fact, they barely told each other. The studio half of the album came from one wonderfully simple idea. Each member of the band was given one side of the record and told, in effect, do whatever you like. It's a strange concept when you think about it. Rather than writing as a band, Roger Waters, David Gilmour, Richard Wright and Nick Mason each disappeared into their own musical worlds. What you end up with isn't really a Pink Floyd album at all. It's almost 4 solo records hiding inside one sleeve. And the results are, well, mixed. Some ideas are beautiful, others are wonderfully bizarre. A few sound like experiments that perhaps should have stayed in the studio. But that's exactly why I love this album. It isn't the sound of a band trying to make a masterpiece. It's the sound of 4 musicians asking themselves who they are without Syd Barrett. Looking back, it's almost like a necessary detour. Before Pink Floyd could become one voice again, each member had to discover their own. They'd spent 2 albums searching for themselves. The next album would prove just how ambitious those searches were becoming. Atom, Heart, Mother. There are few album titles stranger than Atom, Heart, Mother. It sounds like classic Pink Floyd, cryptic, surreal, and impossible to explain, but the truth is almost laughably ordinary. The title came from a newspaper headline describing a woman who had become one of the first people in Britain to receive a pacemaker. Roger Waters happened to see the phrase Atom, Heart, Mother in the article, thought it sounded interesting, and the name simply stuck. I love this story because it reminds us how random creativity can be. We often imagine artists spending months searching for the perfect title when sometimes inspiration is sitting on the back of the breakfast table next to the crossword puzzle. But the real story of the album isn't the title, it's the opening track. Up to this point, Pink Floyd had flirted with long compositions, but Atom, Heart, Mother was different. Nearly 24 minutes long, accompanied by brass, choir, and orchestra. It was by far the most ambitious thing they'd ever attempted, and strangely, the band themselves later became one of its harshest critics. Roger Waters dismissed it. David Gilmour admitted he thought part of it were a load of rubbish, which is fascinating because history has been far kinder to this album than Pink Floyd ever were. Sometimes artists can see the significance of the risks they're taking. Looking back now, this album feels less like a failure and more like the moment Pink Floyd realised there were almost no limits to what they could attempt. And once you've discovered there's no limit, the next question becomes, what are you actually capable of? Meddle. If I had to point to one album where Pink Floyd truly became Pink Floyd, I think I'd choose Meddle. Not because it's their most famous record, because, well, it isn't, but because it's the first time you can hear every ingredient that would soon produce Dark Side of the Moon. The hidden story begins with a single sound, that haunting metallic ping noise that opens echoes. For years I assumed it'd been created with some elaborate synthesizer or expensive studio trick, but in reality it happened almost by accident. Richard Wright sent a single piano note through a Leslie speaker, a piece of equipment normally used with Hammond organs. The rotating speaker transformed that ordinary note into something that sounded almost like sonar echoing across an empty ocean. It was one of those magical studio accidents that nobody could have planned. Instead of moving on, the band built an entire 23-minute composition around it. That is what fascinates me. Most bands hear an accident and ignore it. Pink Floyd heard an accident and followed it wherever it wanted to go. Every time I hear Echoes now, I don't just hear one of progressive rock's greatest songs. I hear the exact moment Pink Floyd realized experimentation didn't have to interrupt songwriting. It could become the songwriting. And once they discovered that, everything started to happen very quickly. Obscured by clouds. poor Obscured by Clouds, it might be one of the most overlooked albums in the entire catalogue. And I think that's largely because of what came next. This album is sandwiched between Meddle and Dark Side of the Moon, and it's often treated like little more than a footnote. But the more I read about it, the more I start to think it's probably one of the most important albums they ever made. Like More, it was written as a soundtrack for a French film. The band travelled to Paris to record it, working remarkably quickly because the film had a deadline. They didn't have months to experiment or endlessly rewrite ideas. They kind of just had to trust themselves. And perhaps that's exactly what makes the album so fascinating. While recording the album, another collection of songs was quietly taking shape in the background. During rehearsals and live performances, Pink Floyd had already begun developing the material that would eventually become The Dark Side of the Moon. Which means this forgotten soundtrack sits at a strange crossroads in their career. On the one side is the experimental Pink Floyd we'd followed through Meddle. On the other is the band about to make one of the greatest albums ever recorded. Sometimes I think of Obscured by Clouds as the last deep breath before history changed. It's the final moment where Pink Floyd was simply another brilliant progressive rock band before the whole world would start to pay attention. And then, without realizing it, they made The Dark Side of the Moon. There are albums that become famous, and then there are albums that become part of culture itself. The Dark Side of the Moon belongs to that second group, which makes the story behind it all the more surprising, because when Pink Floyd began writing it, they weren't thinking about a masterpiece. They were trying to solve a very practical problem. Up until that point, they'd often entered the studio with half-finished ideas, hoping they'd somehow evolve during recording. This time they did the opposite. Before they recorded almost anything, they took an early version of the album on the road. Night after night, audience after audience, they played what was then called Eclipse, a piece for assorted lunatics. Songs changed, lyrics evolved, sections were torn up and rewritten, transitions were smoothed out, and they were effectively workshopping one of the greatest albums ever made in front of thousands of people. I love that because it completely changes the myth of Dark Side. We often imagine masterpieces arriving in flashes of inspiration, but this one didn't. It was refined, it was worked on, it was tested, it was improved, trial and error, night after night. Every audience quietly helping shape the album without even realizing it. And perhaps that's the biggest surprise of all. One of the most perfectly constructed albums in history. It wasn't built in the studio. It was built on the stage. Wish You Were Here. There are some albums that you can explain with facts. Wish You Were Here isn't one of them. I don't think you can really understand this record until you understand who isn't there. By 1975, Syd Barrett had been gone from Pink Floyd for 7 years. His influence, though, had never really left. He wasn't just the band's first songwriter. He was their friend, the person they'd started everything with. And although Pink Floyd had gone on to achieve extraordinary success without him, there was always the feeling they'd left someone behind. That's why they began writing Shine On, You Crazy Diamond. It wasn't just another song. It was a tribute, a way of saying thank you, or perhaps a way of trying to make sense of something none of them had ever really come to terms with. Then something happened that almost feels too unbelievable to be true. While the band were recording the album at Abbey Road Studios, a man quietly walked into the room. He was overweight, his head had been shaved, even his eyebrows were gone. For a few moments, nobody recognized him. It was Syd Barrett. Roger Waters later admitted that seeing him like that was devastating. David Gilmour was stunned. Here was the person they'd been writing about, standing silently in the room, and somehow feeling further away than ever. It's one of those moments in music history that almost sounds fictional. The band are recording a song about losing their friend, and that friend walks through the studio door. But the tragedy is that, in many ways, he was already gone. That's the part of the story I can't stop thinking about. We often imagine losing someone as a single moment. A phone call, a funeral, a goodbye, but sometimes people disappear much more slowly than that. Sometimes they're still standing in front of you, and yet the person you knew has already drifted somewhere you can't reach. Every time I hear the opening notes of Shine On You Crazy Diamond, I don't hear nostalgia, I hear grief. Not the grief of death, but the grief of watching someone slowly become unreachable. And once you hear it that way, I don't think the album ever quite sounds the same again. Animals. If Wish You Were Here is Pink Floyd at their most vulnerable, Animals is Pink Floyd at their most cynical. Inspired loosely by George Orwell's Animal Farm, Roger Waters divided society into three groups: dogs, pigs, and sheep. The powerful, the ruthless, and the people who simply follow. But the hidden story I kept coming back to wasn't actually in the music. It happened before the album was even released. To photograph the cover, Pink Floyd suspended a giant inflatable pig between the chimneys of Battersea Power Station. The plan seemed simple enough. Take the photographs, bring the pig down, go home, except that's not quite what happened. On the second day of the shoot, the crew decided not to tether the pig properly. After all, they'd already taken most of the photographs they needed. Then the wind changed and the pig broke free, drifting across London and eventually entered the flight path of Heathrow Airport. Pilots began reporting a huge inflatable pig floating through controlled airspace. Flights were briefly disrupted before the pig eventually landed in a field in Kent. And I love that story because it's almost too perfect. Here's an album about arrogance, greed, and the absurdity of modern society. And before anyone has ever heard a single note, it's already created one of the most absurd headlines in British music history. But here's my second listen. The pig isn't really the story. The confidence is. Pink Floyd had become so ambitious by this point that suspending a 40-foot inflatable pig over one of London's most recognisable buildings genuinely seemed like a reasonable idea. Somewhere between Piper and Animals, they'd stopped asking, can we? And they started asking, why not? The Wall. It's strange to think that one of the greatest concept albums ever written began with a single moment of frustration. During Pink Floyd's In the Flesh tour, 1977, the band had become almost unimaginably successful. Stadiums were packed, crowds were enormous, but Roger Waters found himself feeling more disconnected from the audience than ever before. Then, during one show in Montreal, something snapped. A fan kept trying to climb onto the stage, and Waters lost his temper and spat at him. Almost immediately, he hated himself for it. And later, Waters admitted that what disturbed him wasn't just the incident itself, it was what it revealed. He realized he'd begun imagining a wall between himself and the audience. Not a physical wall, but an emotional one. Something separating the performer and the listener. Fame and reality, connection and isolation. That one horrible moment became the seed from which the wall eventually grew. Which completely changes the way I hear that album now. Because I used to think The Wall was a story about someone building emotional barriers, but now I hear it as the moment Roger Waters realized he'd already built one. The album wasn't predicting isolation, it was trying to understand how exactly he arrived there. And perhaps that's why it still resonates so deeply, because walls very rarely appear overnight. They get built brick by brick, one disappointment, one fear, one compromise at a time. The final cut. If The Wall felt like Roger Waters building an emotional barrier, the final cut feels like what was left behind once everyone stopped talking. By this point, Pink Floyd were barely functioning as a band. Richard Wright had already left during the making of The Wall. Tensions between Roger Waters and David Gilmour were at breaking point. And what began as a collection of songs left over from the wall slowly evolved into something much more personal. In many ways, the final cut doesn't feel like a Pink Floyd album at all. It feels like Roger Waters speaking directly to the listener. The album is haunted by his father's death during the Second World War, by his anger towards political leaders, and by a growing sense that the ideals people fought for had quietly been abandoned. And that's probably why it sounds so different from everything else that came before it. It isn't trying to be mysterious, it's not trying to be experimental, it's trying to say something. And whether you love the album or not, I think it's impossible to ignore. Looking back, I don't really hear the final cut as the last chapter of The Wall anymore. I hear it as the sound of a partnership coming to an end. The music is still beautiful, but the conversations that created Pink Floyd were beginning to disappear. And then they did. A momentary lapse of reason. When Roger Waters left Pink Floyd in 1985, he genuinely believed that this was the end of the band. In fact, he argued that nobody should continue using the Pink Floyd name at all. David Gilmour disagreed, and what followed wasn't just an argument, it became a legal battle over who had the right to carry the band's name into the future. Eventually, Gilmour won, but when work began on a momentary lapse of reason, there was another problem. How do you convince the world that Pink Floyd still exists when one of its most important creative voices is gone? Gilmour's answer wasn't to imitate Roger Waters, it was to rebuild. The album relied heavily on session musicians, producers and collaborators, something critics pointed to at the time, but I've always found that criticism was kind of unfair, because a momentary lapse of reason was never trying to recreate the past. It was trying to prove that there could still be a future. And every time I listen to it now, I don't hear a band replacing Roger Waters. I hear musicians trying to answer one incredibly difficult question. Can something survive after losing one of the people who defined it? The next album would finally answer that question. The Division Bell. Out of every title in Pink Floyd's catalogue, this might be the most honest, because communication, or the complete failure of it, is woven through almost every song. By now, the years of public arguments between Roger and David had become one of rock music's defining feuds. Whether Waters was still in the band or not, those fractured relationships seemed impossible to ignore. Then there's one of my favourite details from the album. On Keep Talking, the voice you hear isn't Roger Waters, it's not David Gilmour, but it's Stephen Hawking. Gilmour had seen a television advert featuring Hawking's synthetic speaking voice about the importance of communication, and something about it resonated deeply enough that he asked for permission to use it. I love the irony. Here was a scientist who could only communicate through a computer, appearing on an album almost entirely about people failing to communicate with one another. Once I knew that, the album's title suddenly felt even more poignant. The Division Bell isn't really asking why people argue, it's asking why we stop listening. And perhaps that's a question that never really stops being relevant. Which leaves us with just one final album, The Endless River. I can't think of a more fitting way for Pink Floyd's story to end than The Endless River. On paper it's a new studio album, but in reality much of it had been waiting quietly over 20 years. During the recording sessions of The Division Bell, the band had captioned hours of instrumental music that was never developed. And after Richard Wright passed away in 2008, Gilmour and Mason returned to those recordings, not to reinvent them, but to finish them. That's what makes the album so moving to me. It isn't about creating something new, it's almost preserving something that was almost lost. Richard Wright's playing sits at the heart of the record, making it feel less like a reunion and more like one final conversation with an old friend. Every farewell carries a temptation to say one last profound thing. Pink Floyd did something much, much quieter. They listened back, they finished what had been left unfinished, and then they let the music speak for itself. Looking back through all 15 albums, one thing kept surprising me. Pink Floyd's story isn't about success, really. It's about change. Every album marks another turning point, a new idea, a new sound, a friendship, a loss, a disagreement, a risk. We often talk about Pink Floyd as though they were one band, but after making this video, I'm not so sure they ever were. They were constantly becoming something else. Maybe that's why these albums continue to feel so alive today. They're not frozen in time, they're snapshots of people trying to make sense of the moment they were living through. And perhaps that's the real gift of understanding the stories behind music. They don't replace the songs, they deepen them. Because the best records don't reveal everything the first time you hear them, they reward a second listen. Thank you so much for watching, and thanks for joining me on this second listen of Pink Floyd.